Before my daughter's wedding, I stopped by the tailor shop to pick up my suit. The owner pushed me into the fitting room. Quiet. Not a word. Your daughter and her fiancé are about to come in. You need to hear this. I stood behind the curtain. What I heard 1 minute later made my chest tighten as if a heavy steel band had clamped around it. Welcome to the channel. People write to us from the most unexpected places every day. And where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments, and we'll begin. Richard Allen Miller paced the sidewalk of Lakeview Avenue with the slow, unhurried confidence that only a man who owned half the warehouse acreage beyond the interstate could carry. He squinted against the June sun, which had decided to play games with the mirrored storefronts, and thought that a suit costing nearly as much as a decent used car was, of course, pure vanity. But Emily had insisted, and in 25 years he had never built up any real resistance to her requests. He was 72 years old. Behind him were endless lines of 18-wheelers, contracts with the biggest grocery chains in the Midwest, and a logistics hub stitched together with every nerve he had left back when he had been a dispatcher in the brutal 90s. All of that allowed him to indulge almost any whim. But he was not buying this formal suit for his own pride. He was buying it for his beloved daughter, so that when she walked beside him toward the altar, she would see a pillar of strength she could be proud of. Her mother had died when the girl had barely turned 5. Richard remembered that November 21 years ago, down to the second. Emily calling for her mother through feverish tears, and him sitting at her bedside, wiping her damp forehead, silently swearing to himself and to heaven that he would protect her from every hardship life could throw at her. 17 years earlier, Linda had come into their lives. His daughter had accepted her without any open war, but the center of Richard's world had remained the same. Emily was his inner compass. She was the reason he built an empire, fought off auditors, survived a heart scare 3 years ago, and dragged himself out of a hospital room after only a week. Because who else, if not him, would one day place her hand into her husband's? Louise Parker's tailor shop, hid in a quiet courtyard behind an archway. Inside were clean tile floors, 3 silent mannequins standing in the corner, and the eternal watch of a tea kettle on the windowsill. Richard arrived 20 minutes early, expecting the usual warmth, strong tea, and an easy conversation that did not have to mean anything. Louise had rented that space from him for 15 years, and long ago she had grown beyond the status of a simple tenant. She had become a person whose honesty he never questioned. But today, the owner met him right at the door. Her face had turned the color of stale chalk, and instead of her usual hello, she grabbed his elbow with a force impossible to expect from a tiny woman who had spent her life working with a needle. Richard Allen, not a sound. Come with me, quickly. She practically shoved him through the narrow opening of the fitting room, pulled the heavy curtain shut, and pressed one finger to her lips. Louise, what is this? Did you decide to play spy? What kind of show is this? Be quiet, she whispered, barely moving her jaw. Emily and Paul will be here any minute. They think I went out for lunch. The intern will let them in. You have to hear this, Richard Allen. You simply have to. He tried to object. In decades of business, competitors had tried to cheat him. Inspectors had tried to squeeze him. And one contractor had even managed to run off with a shipment of rebar. But hiding in the fitting room of a women's tailor shop was a new low in his career. And yet, there was something in Louise's eyes, something in the way her lower lip trembled, that made him lean back against the mirrored wall and go still. A few minutes later, the front door answered with a short knock. Paul's voice came first, but it was not the polite, smooth tone Richard had grown used to during their acquaintance. This was rough, rolling, confident, the voice of a man who believed he owned the room. It was how a person sounded after ripping off a tiresome mask and tossing it aside. The documents need to be on the table Monday, right after the celebration. Full power of attorney over everything, the warehouses, the accounts, management authority. He's digging in. Emily's voice sounded irritated, with a spoiled edge that made her completely unrecognizable. He keeps saying Walsh has to read everything first. Walsh is his lawyer, you understand? If that old fox gets his teeth into the paperwork, we're done. Then turn on the actress routine. Cry. Tell him it's for our future together. You're a professional at this. You've been doing it for 26 years. Richard froze, afraid even his breathing would betray him. Paul kept throwing out numbers with the precision of a cold-blooded liquidator. Power of attorney. Sale of assets within a month. Saw around $750,000 in liquid cash. Nearly $3 million in property. A petition to have Richard declared incompetent. A paid psychiatrist. A diagnosis of progressive dementia without unnecessary formalities. A private memory care facility out in the middle of nowhere, where, as Paul put it, old people were erased from memory in 6 months. The plan was simple. By January, they would be overseas. I'm tired of playing the obedient daughter, Emily snapped, and there was not a single ounce of doubt in her voice. I can't listen to those endless memoirs about the hard old days anymore. I did not sign up to change diapers for an old man who will be drooling in 5 years. I need freedom. I want him to disappear from the horizon. Scalding moisture crawled down Richard's face. It took him a moment to realize they were tears. In his mind, he saw little Emily on a bicycle by the lakefront, her tiny hand inside his, sleepless nights beside her crib, store shelves he had been ready to empty just to see her smile. And that same Emily was planning to lock him away in a concrete box while she blew through his inheritance. He jerked toward the exit. Louise grabbed his wrist in a dead grip. She pressed herself against him in the cramped fitting room and shook her head desperately. With one hand, she pulled out her phone and typed in large letters. If you go out now, they'll turn it into a joke and they'll use your anger as proof of that dementia. A second message followed. Wait, we need facts. You have to hit them for sure. Behind the curtain, Paul gave a short, self-satisfied laugh. The old romantic is paying for his own farewell and doesn't even know where this is going. And he didn't cheap out on the suit either. The perfect ending, Emily answered with such lightness that Richard's throat closed. The banquet's on the house anyway. Richard shut his eyes, feeling the cold of the glass against the back of his head. The pain in his chest was sharp. The sentimental father of the bride evaporated. In his place, the old Richard Miller began to wake up, the one who, in 1998, after losing almost his entire fleet, regained his position in 3 months and crushed a competitor who had dared to play dirty. 20 minutes later, the footsteps faded. Richard left his hiding place and dialed a number that had been gathering dust in his phone for a good decade. Quinn, it's Miller. I need everything you can find on Paul Archer Gladwell, down to the last unpaid parking ticket, every ex-girlfriend, every cheap little debt. I want it on my desk by morning. The next evening, Richard deliberately made himself late to the restaurant by the pier. It was an old negotiation trick from the last century, the kind that made opponents lose their balance. He entered the dining room half an hour late, leaning theatrically on a cane he needed about as much as a fifth leg, and allowed Paul to take him by the elbow. Dad, why did you take so long? We were going crazy over here. Emily smiled brilliantly, and Richard caught himself thinking that she had clearly inherited her acting skills from her mother's side. In the middle of dinner, he tossed out the first piece of bait, casually, between sips of water. I got a call from the Internal Revenue Service. They are preparing a major sweep of transportation companies together with other agencies. They may freeze every participant's accounts for 5 years, and anyone who signs powers of attorney during that period automatically gets pulled into a criminal investigation. His daughter's face turned earthy. Paul dropped his napkin and ducked under the table after it, trying to hide his disobedient fingers. 5 years? Emily pressed her palm against the table so hard the dishes rang. That's ridiculous. The money is ours. I wanted to say, it's for your treatment, Dad. How can they do that? Richard Allen, you're clearly worked up. Paul instantly switched back into his velvet voice. Remember what the doctor said. Under stress, you sometimes see things that aren't really there. Linda immediately picked up the same melody. Richard, remember that story with the security guard at the yard? You were convinced he was stealing from you, too. You just need rest. Richard played defeat. He obediently lowered his shoulders, pressed his hand to his temple, and admitted that perhaps he was overworked. He nodded in agreement when Paul gently reminded him about the documents for tomorrow. He left the restaurant with a slow gait, dragging the useless cane behind him, while inside his head the chessboard was already arranging itself. The wedding would be the final position. At dawn, Richard sat in Matthew Quinn's office. Around them were mountains of folders, empty coffee mugs, and ashtrays packed to the rim with cigarette butts. Matthew Quinn, a sad man with heavy eyelids, and the gaze of someone who had seen too much of the wrong side of life, laid printouts before him, like cards in a fatal game of solitaire. You're tech genius, Quinn said with a dry snort. The company address is a closet in a business center, squeezed between a freight broker and a pawn shop. Not one living employee. No software. Just a website and a stack of fake reviews. Get to the point. He's buried in debt, Richard. Underground betting. The wagers didn't land. He owes certain people $80,000. Due Monday, right after the wedding. And these people won't be sending polite legal notices. They'll pour him into concrete. Richard kept silent. Quinn hesitated, then laid down the last card. A grainy photograph. Dusk. Drizzle, Paul, deep in a hooded sweatshirt, handing a small package to a sloppy-looking man in a wrinkled white coat. Former paramedic, kicked out of the profession for prescription fraud. Your future son-in-law bought a very specific heart medication from him. Injected or mixed properly, it looks like a catastrophic rhythm failure. At your age, with your history, it would be written off as an ordinary heart attack. A routine medical examiner wouldn't suspect anything unless he was looking for it. Richard picked up the photograph and stared for a long time at Paul's face. Focused, businesslike. The face of a middle manager closing a deal. It was the face of a man purchasing someone else's death in order to pay his bills. He did not need islands. He needed basic survival, and the price of Richard's life suited him just fine. We hand them over, Quinn said. Richard carefully returned the photograph to the desk. The police means drawn-out questioning, lawyers who can build a story in a week about medicine for an old man, and bail. Paul will clean up the loose ends, take Emily, and vanish into the fog. We need something more fundamental, a public ending, one after which no reputation can be rebuilt. No, Quinn asked. Richard lifted his eyes to his old friend. No, I need equipment for the wedding. Cameras, directional microphones, your whole collection. It's time to prepare a father of the bride speech everyone will remember. Quinn had not yet finished preparing everything. Wedding equipment required careful setup and extra hands. But life had already thrown Richard another turn he had not seen coming. That morning, when he came downstairs earlier than usual, he found Paul in the kitchen by the stove. He stood there in an unbuttoned shirt, holding a teapot, glowing with that radiant, carefully rehearsed expression that now made Richard want to keep his distance. "Richard Allen, speak of the devil. I got an herbal blend from Colorado, invaluable for circulation. I brewed it especially for you." Paul set a cup in front of him. Steam rose from the dark infusion, and as Richard looked at the porcelain, he suddenly understood with perfect clarity that he was staring at his own ending, politely served with a saucer and spoon. "Grateful, Paul. You're showing rare concern." He accepted the cup, brought it toward his face, and at that exact moment allowed his hand to tremble. He closed his eyes, swayed, and braced himself against the countertop. The cup slipped free and shattered, spraying the rug with brown splashes. Paul's mask fell away for a single instant, his face twisted with naked rage. He clenched the kitchen towel, then hurriedly restored an expression of deep sympathy. "Oh, careful. Are you feeling sick?" Richard found no words for an answer. From the hallway rolled in Bagel, a 12-year-old dachshund who, in all her fussy years, had ignored both prime steak and gourmet pâté. But the puddle on the floor awakened a sudden investigative passion in her. Bagel touched the fibers with her tongue a couple of times before Richard caught her by the collar and dragged her away. 3 minutes later, the dog collapsed, her paws seized in spasms. White foam appeared on her muzzle. Her spine arched. "What the hell?" Richard grabbed the dog. "We're going to the emergency vet." "Maybe rodent poison?" Paul said quickly. "Stray cats could have brought something in." I noticed, but Richard was already walking fast, ignoring the excuse. The situation looked absurd. The dachshund had not left the house since the previous evening. In the waiting room, with his skin smeared in the animal's foam and saliva, Richard sat without taking his eyes off the exam room door. They pulled Bagel back after an hour and a half. The veterinarian came out with a tired face and said the dose had clearly not been calculated for a 26-pound dog, but for someone much larger. Even a few drops from the rug had been enough to bring her to the edge. The dog would make it, but she would spend at least 3 days on intravenous fluids. Had Richard taken even one swallow, he would have been convulsing himself by now. His life would have been fading, while Paul stood nearby pretending to be confused, and Emily forced tears out of herself. The fear that had previously hovered somewhere in his subconscious finally burned away. Richard Allen Miller, who had only wanted to teach his daughter a lesson at the celebration, disappeared. In his place stood a man without brakes, and that made him a serious threat. He pulled out his phone and called Quinn. "Matthew, the strategy changes. I need to take everything back, down to the last dollar." That same evening, Richard met with his lawyer, Leonard Walsh, in a roadside diner, a faceless place with plastic furniture and a silent television in the corner. Walsh was waiting for him with 2 identical leather folders, impossible to tell apart at a glance. "In this one," Walsh said, opening the first, "the papers Paul prepared. Full power of attorney, rights over assets, change of control." Then he touched the second folder with his palm. "And here is our decoy. It looks like the same package. But instead of transferring property rights, it contains an admission of responsibility. And this form," he pointed to a page headed "Consent for Medical Intervention," essentially locks in the fact of coercion. "Change of writing hand," Richard said. "Sign with your left." "You've been right-handed for 70 years, Richard. Behind you are thousands of invoices and contracts. if Paul doesn't catch it, and he'll be too drunk on triumph to notice, the simple fact that you used the wrong hand destroys any argument that it was voluntary. Combined with everything else, that's the finish. Playing on the edge, Walsh noted, collecting the papers. There will be no miss. Richard took the switched folder. Money has blinded him so completely that he wouldn't object even if I signed with my foot. 2 days later, Richard called an ambulance crew and arranged himself on the floor in the hallway. When the paramedic asked him the current year, he breathed out 1985. The preliminary conclusion was confirmed, a possible disturbance in cerebral blood flow. Paul and Emily appeared in the hospital room an hour later. Paul had an inflamed stare and a nervous twitch at the corner of his mouth. Marcus's creditors were blowing up his phone, and the enormous debt was visibly burning his back. "Richard Allen, you need to sign. The situation is critical. They may need to intervene. The surgeons won't begin without formal consent." The phrases poured out of him like hail, tangled and rushed, and Richard noted bitterly that there was not one drop of truth in that stream. Neither his future son-in-law nor his daughter called a doctor in, asked about the details of his condition, or even asked what exact procedure they were talking about. Emily squeezed his forearm. "Dad, please, sign it for your own good, for us." When Richard's right hand lost mobility, Paul, without a second thought, placed the expensive fountain pen, a prestigious accessory Richard himself had given him last Christmas, into his left hand. Richard produced a broken, uncertain scrawl. They snatched up the folder and left without honoring him with another glance. In the doorway, Paul was already giving instructions over the phone. "Start the process. We have all the papers." Richard pushed himself up to a sitting position, poured water, looked at his left hand, and realized that this limb had just determined their future in a place with locked doors. He used the call button and asked the staff to invite the police so he could report the theft of documents. When the attending doctor insisted on admission, Richard signed a refusal. That same standard form medical staff place in front of stubborn patients with the expression of people washing their hands of responsibility. They released him closer to midnight after confirming that his blood pressure was stable and that the patient was firmly determined to leave. Deep in the night, at 2 o'clock, he sat in his car near the riverfront and listened carefully through an earpiece to what was happening inside Paul's car. Quinn had handled the equipment the day before. Paul was talking to a woman over a connection. The old man folded. He's sitting in a hospital room, rambling about the last century. Perfect. "How long does he have?" the woman asked casually, as if she were asking about the weather. "The combo of stress and the medication. His engine will quit within a couple of days. By the time dessert comes out at the banquet, he'll either be on a crash cart or in the morgue." Richard recorded every word. The conversation revealed that the woman's name was Jenna Gladwell. She was Paul's legal wife. Their marriage had been registered in Tampa 5 years earlier and was still active. The registration with Emily, as Quinn later established, had been done with a forged identity. In the county clerk's database, Paul appeared under another last name, clean and unmarried. The upcoming celebration was turning into a legal phantom. But the worst thing was something else. Paul referred to Emily as a chick, empty, clingy, and obsessed. He admitted he could barely stand her presence. He said he had installed cameras in the bedroom and kept files for blackmail in case Emily decided to make claims against the inheritance. Richard pulled off the headphones and sat in silence for a long time. She had acted viciously, but she was his blood. Hearing that con man talk about his daughter as disposable material awakened something in him that he had thought Emily's betrayal had killed for good. A dull animal need to shield his child, even from her own mistakes. He called Stan, a former company specialist. Stan, the job is to open one subject's cloud, delete certain content, and keep duplicates. Not for the internet, for my personal archive. When Richard got home near dawn, he went into his study, a private room with yellowed maps on the walls and a box of fine tobacco. Behind a river landscape hung a steel safe. The passcode was the date he bought the house, known only to two people. Richard entered the code. The locks clicked. The niche opened. It was empty. $500,000 in collectible coins. Jewelry that had belonged to Emily's late mother. All of it had vanished. In the morning, he sat across from Linda. She burst into tears immediately, not waiting for accusations. Clearly, this weight had been pressing on her for a long time. "Paul came to me a month ago," she said. "He said it was a once-in-a-lifetime chance, a project that would triple the investment in 6 months. He showed charts, testimonials, partners from New York. I wanted to surprise you, Richard. I wanted to say at the celebration, 'Look, I'm worth something too. All these years I never brought a single dollar into this house, and now I finally did.'" "The amount?" he interrupted. "Everything that was in the safe, and the accounts. Another million, $1.5 million total." He stayed silent. Linda was not a villain. She was simply a woman who had spent nearly 2 decades in the shadow of her husband, desperately wanting, just once, to prove her importance. Paul had found that crack and drained it to the bottom. Her gullibility looked sad and destructive at the same time. There were no allies left in this house. But that realization did not bring bitterness. It brought a strange lightness. A person who has lost everything loses fear as well. By breakfast, Richard was in Walsh's office, watching the lawyer analyze the scale of the financial disaster. "This is a fiasco, Richard Allen. There's a debt pit ahead. Leonard, we need to open safe deposit box 27 at First Prairie Bank." Walsh lifted his eyes. "My old man," Richard lowered his voice, "went through serious trials and had no illusions about banks. Back in the hard years, he quietly registered commercial spaces downtown through a trusted person. A couple of halls and a retail unit. Inheritance. Personal property acquired before marriage isn't subject to division under the law. I kept it secret. Neither Linda nor my daughter knows. Today, it's worth around $5 million. Paul scanned all your assets," the lawyer said, understanding instantly. "Only the digital ones. He forgot I belong to another generation. Those properties exist only in paper archives, locked inside a box. Put up one lot as collateral through First Prairie. They have an express lending program against commercial properties. You know it better than I do. Funds on the business account by lunch." The final move remained, the most painful one. Richard called Detective Bennett from the Financial Crimes Unit, a man he had once helped. He passed along the data about Paul's investment, transaction charts, fake investment reports, and asked for only one thing. By evening, freeze every account connected to Emily Miller, Linda Miller, and Paul Archer Gladwell. Not $1 was to move. No transfer, no withdrawal, no plane ticket purchase. Bennett listened and promised. "If the evidence checks out, everything will be frozen by tonight." Richard set the phone down and stared at it for a long time. He had just, in essence, turned in his own wife. A woman who had looked after his home for years, made tea for him in the evenings, and faithfully waited for him to return from road trips that belonged to a long-gone past. Waited out of habit, because waiting had become her nature. He understood this would crush her, but he understood something else, too. It was the only chance to keep Linda from making more mistakes. Paul had already used her hands to commit a crime, and when, on Monday, he reached for the stolen capital, instead of obedient numbers on a screen, he would run into a deaf, immovable wall. The industrial zone by the river port greeted Richard with the roar of cranes and the thick, stubborn smell of fuel and oil that had soaked into the concrete for decades. It seemed as if the stench would not leave, even if someone flooded the place with bleach or covered it with 100 years of rain. Marcus Reed's office was tucked into a low brick building behind 2 layers of security. The guard at the checkpoint looked Richard over and, with a short nod, indicated an ordinary door at the end of the hallway. Marcus turned out to be a stocky, short man in a tracksuit. He belonged to the kind of people who did not need to raise their voices for everyone around them to freeze and start absorbing every word. The owner of the office sat behind a desk buried under invoices and folders. When Richard lowered himself into the chair without ceremony, Marcus did not even move. He only waited, studying his visitor. "You're holding Gladwell's note for $80,000. Richard laid a cashier's check in front of him. "I don't intend to pay off his debts. I came to buy them." Marcus slowly moved his gaze from the paper to the visitor. For a while he said nothing, tapping a rhythm on the desk with the pads of his fingers. "He a relative of yours? Son-in-law? Potentially." "You're a thorough man, Richard Miller." Marcus dug the necessary sheet from the depths of a drawer, skimmed it, and pushed it toward his guest. "Take it. Notice the boy listed rights to his future inheritance as collateral. Your property, by the way. That's what he was counting on." Richard accepted the document, folded it carefully, and hid it in his breast pocket, right beside the photographs confirming the purchase of the forbidden compound. Now, pressed against his chest, he effectively carried Paul's entire future, fitted into a few handwritten pages. At the lavish rehearsal dinner in an elite waterfront hotel ballroom, Richard sat at the head of the table. He displayed such composure that it seemed he had been preparing for this role for decades. Paul, whose face had already taken on the characteristic wine-colored tint of too much drinking, moved toward him around 10 in the evening. Leaning close to his future father-in-law's ear, he said he had already found a buyer for the family mansion. "Make sure your old ghost is gone from there by the time we get back from the cruise. Got it, old man?" Then he slapped Richard on the cheek twice. Those short, mocking taps were meant to crush the last of someone else's dignity. After that, Paul strolled away toward the bar. Emily immediately rushed over. She began straightening the collar of Richard's shirt, but there was no care in the gesture, only a squeamish desire to tidy up a damaged piece of scenery. "Dad, just act like you're having fun when the flashes go off. You're here for atmosphere. Don't you dare ruin our celebration." Richard took a sip of apple juice, which from the side could easily pass for expensive champagne, and felt the skin on his cheek still burning from the slaps. He stood to give a toast. He remembered bringing Emily home from the hospital, swimming with her in Lake Michigan, swearing to protect her from any hardship. The guest smiled tenderly. Then he looked straight at Paul. "And you, Paul, have been a true revelation for our family. We will remember your lessons in trust for the rest of our lives." Paul visibly tensed. His fingers tightened around the thin glass of his wine flute, but there was nothing he could object to. From the outside, it sounded like an ordinary fatherly blessing. Richard added that he had prepared a special gift, something that had taken a lifetime to create and only a moment to hand over. For one brief instant, Paul saw something frightening in his eyes. Not weakness, not confusion, but cold, measured power. Then Richard lowered his eyelids and awkwardly spilled juice on the tablecloth. His hand trembled noticeably as he did it. Paul exhaled, convincing himself that the old man's dementia was simply playing hide and seek with him. The next day, the banquet hall accepted 300 guests, massive rock crystal chandeliers, armfuls of fresh flowers, and tables draped in snow-white fabric. The county clerk formalities were behind them. The stamps had been placed, the rings were on their fingers. Huge screens showed a retrospective. Little Emily, engagement photos, family footage. The bride glowed in a dress that cost as much as a down payment on a house. Paul shone with triumph. When the MC gave the floor to the father of the bride, the hall exploded with applause. Richard rose, leaving his cane by the chair. He spoke quietly, but the acoustics carried every word to the farthest rows. On the day she was born, I promised myself no monster would ever touch her. I built, worked, and breathed only for her. The guests grew emotional. Linda kept pressing a handkerchief to the corners of her eyes. And now, my surprise. Richard held the pause without taking his eyes off Paul. You won't find a gift like this on any registry. It comes straight from the thick of life. He pulled a small remote from his pocket and pressed the button. The festive images on the screens went dark instantly. After 1 second of confusion, Paul's voice came through the powerful speakers that had just been playing a violin waltz. The sound was so clean and full that not one nuance escaped the audience. When will he die? A woman's voice asked. A dose of the medication, under stress, and his engine quits within a couple of days, Paul answered. By the time the guests get to dessert, he'll either be with the emergency team or in the morgue. The hall froze. Then the second recording played. In it, Paul called his brand new wife a chick, admitted that her clinginess made him sick, and bragged about an archive of compromising files collected by hidden cameras in their home. Chaos broke out. Someone jumped up from a chair. Someone else covered her mouth in horror. Linda let out a tearing scream. Emily, crushed by what she had heard, could not stay on her feet. She sank to the floor, crushing the luxurious hem of her dress under her. Paul sprang up, choking on shouts about forgery and editing. He first lunged toward the DJ booth, then toward the emergency exit. Louise Parker watched all of this from the front row, keeping an astonishing calm. When Paul tried to fly past her, she simply stuck out her foot without changing her expression. The glass in her hand did not even tremble. Paul hit the marble floor face first. The fabric at the knees of his pants split. Blood ran down his chin. Stan, Richard's systems administrator, who had spent the whole evening successfully blending in as a distant relative, immediately pinned the fleeing groom to the floor. The heavy doors at the end of the hall swung open. 4 plainclothes officers from Detective Bennett's unit walked in at a measured pace. Richard took the microphone again. Conspiracy to take a life, fraud on a grand scale, embezzlement, and the cherry on top, the marriage you just celebrated is illegal. The groom has a current wife in Tampa and a forged ID under another last name to go with it. He carelessly tossed the microphone aside. Bennett presented the paperwork. When Paul was lifted from the floor by both arms, he screamed himself hoarse, accusing his father-in-law of insanity and forgery. Bennett remained impartial. "You think you got me, old man?" Paul rasped as they dragged him toward the exit. "Tomorrow, my lawyers get me out, and I'll come by for tea." Richard came close, leaning heavily on his cane, and spoke so the words were meant for one recipient only. "Even if you get out, Marcus's people will be waiting outside. Remember your debt? That note belongs to me now. I'm your main creditor, Paul. So behind bars, you'll be much safer than you would be free." Paul's face turned the color of dirt. For the first time, there was no trace of confidence left in his eyes, only paralyzing horror. Richard turned toward his daughter. She was still on the floor, reaching trembling hands toward him. "Dad, the murder part wasn't me. I swear I didn't know anything," she whispered through sobs. He lowered himself beside her and touched her hair. In that moment, his soul seemed to crack. One part of him demanded that he pull her to his chest and comfort her immediately. The other understood that this very same all-forgiving love had led them to this catastrophe. "You had everything, Emily. A house, a father, a home, safety, but you wanted to play grown-up life at someone else's expense." He pulled out a $100 bill and let it go. The paper drifted down onto her white dress. "For a cab. Go wherever you want, but forget my address. You're 26. You wanted independence so badly. Accept it as a gift. Maybe Louise Parker will take you at the tailor shop to mop floors. Honest work is very good for clearing the head." His heart demanded that he save her, but his mind ordered him to stand firm. He knew that if he yielded now, she would never learn to answer for her own choices. It was the bitterest expression of love in his life, to leave her without help so she could find herself. Linda flew toward him and grabbed his jacket. "Richard, do something. Call the bank. Declare bankruptcy. You can do anything. My father's real estate is my personal property, acquired before marriage. Read the family property statute sometime. And the money you so generously transferred into Paul's hands was your personal investment in life experience. The divorce petition is with your sister. She received it this morning while they were curling your hair." 17 years, Richard. We've been together so many years. I gave you a life in gold and my loyalty. You traded it for the smile of the first hustler who crossed your path. Everyone carries their own consequences. He headed for the exit. The guests parted before him like waves, in complete silence. They had expected a festive show and received the wreckage of other people's lives. In the parking lot, Richard ordered them to bring not the rented luxury sedan, but his own personal car. It stood off by itself among the shining limousines, a little battered by life, with a distinctive scrape on one fender. Once behind the wheel, he did not drive toward the gated community. He turned onto the highway, leading south. Chicago gradually disappeared in the mirrors, the city where he had built an empire and where he had left his past. A couple of hours later, he stopped at a roadside diner, bought a slice of honey cake and strong tea. His phone lit up with a message from Walsh. "Assets under control. Documents filed with the court. Paul is locked up. You are free, Richard Allen. What are your coordinates?" Richard quickly typed back, "Gone fishing." On the Florida Panhandle, he owned a tiny house bought long ago with personal savings, a place his family did not even know existed. A boat waited for him there, along with silence and morning tea, without the risk of finding poison in it. An old song came on the radio, the same kind that had played in truck cabs when, as a young man, he drove through the night fog with a full trailer and an empty wallet. For a moment, he pictured Emily on the cold hotel floor. Maybe, with time, she would understand everything. Maybe she would not. He was 72. He had no family in the usual sense and no old home left. But the tank was full of gas. There was solid money in his account, and his pulse was steady and strong. He was alive, and perhaps, for the first time in decades, he was free to do exactly as he wished. And now tell me honestly, what would you have done in Richard's place? Could you walk away from your own daughter to teach her the hardest lesson of her life? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Give this video a like if the story moved you, and make sure you're subscribed with the bell turned on so you don't miss the next one.